It's a pleasure to be in Linköping for the first time, and I appreciate the invitation and the company. It's not often that I attend workshops of this kind. This is not a major field in Iceland. How I came to it, I'm not quite sure. It occurred to me in the middle of writing the biography that just recently that I did my BA dissertation in Iceland in anthropology in 1972 on the concept of race. So for some reason I was interested in racial issues. I think I was closely attending to the battle in America, the Black Panthers, and anyway, that lay dormant for decades until I picked it up. But currently I'm writing on the Anthropocene, basically, and listening to you, Lena, it occurs to me, of course it relates to colonialism, and you may well argue that the Anthropocene began with slavery and plantations, and some say we should not speak about the Anthropocene, but rather the plantation scene. So the Anthropocene, of course, is simply the current period in which humans are increasingly and radically affecting the planet itself. But here you have the title and abstract, I guess, somewhere. And, biographies in the broad sense, narrating the lives and genomes of the enslaved. It's a paper co-authored with Sarah Abel, who's now in a postdoc position at Cambridge University, but both of us have been working on a project called CityGen. It's on citizenship and genetics and belonging. It's a European HERA project, as they say, organized by Copenhagen, Hannes Schröder, a German archaeologist, Copenhagen University. And the current paper that I'm kind of browsing through is just submitted to a book on slavery and literature, which will be edited by Mads Anders Bakkesgaard in Aarhus and his team. And I'm happy to share the paper with anyone if you want the draft. Just send me email. And I have another paper just recently out, again co-authored with Sarah Abel, as well as George F. Tyson, who's a historian on St. Croix in the formerly Danish West Indies. And that paper was published in this year in Comparative Studies in Society and History, and is entitled From Enslavement to Emancipation, Naming Practices in the Danish West Indies. Naming is, I think, an exciting anthropological issue. It involves our identities and relations, and it's highly pertinent to slavery because slavery typically suppressed identity, ethnicity, history, and personhood, and the rest of it through the practice of renaming and nicknaming, sometimes in the form of abusing names. I'm happy to share that paper too. We bought open access, so it's free from Comparative Studies in Society and History.
I would like the references.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So what I have been working on with Sarah Abel, who was a postdoc in my department in this CityGen project for the last 3 years, is heavily focused on writing and biographies, and I'm speaking about these two forms of biography here. The classic one, as in my case, I mean, I go into the archives, I visit the sites, I talk to descendants if they exist and are available, etc. That's highly useful, of course, and especially in the case of slavery, we need these kinds of documentations because the past has been silenced. And I keep thinking about the news yesterday and the day before. More than 100 Afro-American graves were discovered under a shopping mall in Florida. It had been, these were the graves of people who died early last century, and they are just there, and now they're digging them up for some reason, having buried them for decades. But overall, slavery has been silenced, and there are only a few biographies of slaves. Other biographies can be told through increasingly DNA studies are used to dive into the historical past, and I've partly been involved, and the case of Hans Jonathan has become a famous one in that context, and I'll say a bit about that. And so through writing the histories of slaves and analyzing their DNA, we can dig up the past, and no doubt the DNA revolution will play an important and increasing role in the near future. I think I'll rush through my slides to give you a sense of Hans Jonathan and the case and my study, and the two biographies, and to open the discussion on biographies written through DNA analysis and archival sources and ethnographies, anthropologies. And this book came out a couple of years ago with Chicago, and is now out in 4 languages, French and Danish and Icelandic. This is practically the only thing that Hans Jonathan wrote, so we cannot have access to many of his many documents relating to him, but he ended his life more or less as an accountant in a Danish store in East Iceland. Djúpivogur, am I okay here? And this is a contemporary etch or drawing by a Danish traveler at the time. And this is where Hans Jonathan ended his life, in a place, in a farm called Borgargarður, on the outskirts of this small place. And this is, he wrote about 10 or 15 sheets like that exist in the National Archives in Reykjavik, and they're signed and written by him. And these are documentations of trading. I mean, things come in from the metropole, from Copenhagen, and they go out, and somehow they have to balance and sell to the local farmers in the neighborhood. And this was his job. And that's all we have, unfortunately, no letters or memoirs or anything. And this is Djúpivogur today, beautiful site and famous mountain. These are the buildings that he would work in. They've been renovated, but they still exist. And it's a small fishing community now. Before coming to Iceland, he lived in Copenhagen, and this is one of the buildings he may have lived in 1801, and a few years before that, owned by the Schimmelmann family in the center of Copenhagen. The picture is from 1905, I think. And before Copenhagen, he was on a plantation in St. Croix and Constitution Hill, and partly in the town itself, but partly on a plantation. And this is one of the few documentations of him and his mother. Anyway, this lists the Constitution Hill plantation. It's now the property of an American couple. But it was one of the big plantations, and Danish colonialism, as you know, was huge, although it was not on the scale of the British. The Denmark Danes transported 85,000 slaves from Africa. And I've just visited the National Museum of Afro-American History and Culture in Washington, which was a fantastic experience. And there's quite a few bits on Danish colonialism. It's a painting from the center of St. Croix, the harbor, and it's still the desktop image on my iPad. So every time I open it, I dive into horses and sugar products and colonial ships. And this is in Fredrikstad. This is the place where slaves were brought in from Africa. Hans Jonathan's mother was Emilia Regina, and it's not quite sure whether she was born on St. Croix or in Africa, but documentation seems to me to indicate that her family was from Ghana, and like many others. And the slaves were kind of cleaned up and
Is that George Tyson, or what type? How did you track the documentation?
I haven't really tried. I haven't really found the exact links, and just judging from literary evidence. I mean, the ships where they came from, and the majority of slaves from that period came from the castle and the coast, Gold Coast. But we'll get back to that. DNA may tell another story. And this is Constitution Hill, a famous painting from the time, and it shows it's a beautiful painting and often used, and it's an art critic would see a lot in it, and there's a kind of duality here. Here's an aristocratic person, I imagine, is shielded from the sun, and here's an open one with a slave bringing stuff out of the plantation, and this one is coming in. The huts for the slaves are up there, and it's the production facilities. And this is the field site, if you like. The slaves came from Ghana or nearby and taken to St. Croix. Unfortunately, this is in Icelandic. And by the way, I did a small study in the Cape Verde Islands in 1984. That was my only professional connection to, but I met some descendants of slaves. And maybe that subconsciously affected my take on this. And Hans Jonathan is taken to Europe at the age of 7 in Copenhagen, spends 10 years there with his Schimmelmann, and then escapes to to Iceland at the age of 17, following a famous court case which established that he was property of Frau Schimmelmann, and so he stole himself, and that's the title I stole from his defendant, who was a careless guy, but nevertheless defended him and used the rhetoric of stealing oneself.
And slavery was illegal in Denmark at the time. There wasn't no.
It was becoming illegal. Yeah. They had decided it would be illegal a year after, so it was the last chance.
But before that, there weren't any laws about slavery in particular, right? There were about other types of enslaved, but not slavery necessarily.
Yes.
So that complicated. I mean, it's just a fascinating.
Yeah, it is a fascinating, and fortunately we have the. Fortunately, we have the court case proceedings and lots of stuff there, the arguments, and also the debates about the legal conclusion. People argued that the servitude, which was an established thing in Scandinavia, was not the same as property in person.
Sorry.
It
was abolished in Sweden in the 1330s.
Okay.
So it's a very different story. Sorry.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Good to know. It was in Iceland, but of course Iceland was a Danish colony. It's an exciting court case, and I think I had this fascination early on to write this story. It was dramatic. I was sitting in a hotel room in Copenhagen and sipping my Carlsberg beer when I saw a documentary on the descendants of this guy, and I knew some of the people interviewed from the Westman Isles, where I was born and raised. And I thought, this is crazy. Here is me, an anthropologist, watching a TV documentary in Denmark on some of my neighbors in this tiny fishing community south of the Icelandic coast, exploring their African roots. I had no knowledge of any blackness in their veins, and had written my BA dissertation on race. So there was lots of strings. And this is a memorial event 2 or 3 years ago in East Iceland, and Hans Jonathan's grave is unknown, but he must be in this graveyard. So his descendants, partly as a result of my book, I think, decided to establish a memorial stone with his name and his wife, Katrin. And these are some of the people who attended. Some of them drove for 8 hours from Reykjavik to attend, and it was quite an interesting event. So part of my book and part of my fascination with this story is the question, how did Icelanders receive this guy, and why did they embrace him? The stories of him are all quite positive. He was a nice guy who, unlike most Danish merchants at the time in the Icelandic independence rhetoric, he wouldn't cheat his customers in the store, and taught people navigation, etc., and preached not too much drinking, etc. It seems Icelanders took him just as a guy from the next village or next firth or the next county, somewhat different from others, but there was not a hint of any racial discussion. He was a mulatto. Maybe he was more light-skinned than most Ghanaians. And his father was European. I'll come back to that later. But the idea of race came later, and this image is from an early 19th century manuscript, and I think it kind of illustrates that race is coming. It's a local, it's Icelandic, is a peasant writer who is classifying mannakynið, the human race, and blackness has arrived in the Icelandic worldview, and it's not necessarily good, but this was non-existent at the time.
Woman next to black men?
This one?
Yeah. Is that just another type?
I imagine a white lady,
Yeah, so
yeah, to contrast the blackness. And I argue in the book, and the argument, of course, is borrowed from Danish historians and others who have argued convincingly that race only came with slavery and colonialism. I mean, before that, we didn't have the idea of blackness and race, which we're still struggling with. And the descendants of Hans Jonathan experienced some stigma, although he himself did not experience it. And we're into the Colonial Rhetoric, which is the famous Danish koloniudstilling, showing all the Danish colonies, and there were living Inuit and black people from St. Croix, etc. Icelanders refused to join on the same terms as they would say old ladies from St. Croix or Eskimos, and they thought that was denigrating. So an exhibit was fine, but please don't place us on the same level as people from St. Croix or Greenland. And some of the descendants, they clearly experienced stigma, and they would hide their origins. Here's a family picture. Some, nevertheless, sort of cherish the background, and you see the Afro-American features. These are grandchildren or great-grandchildren. And much later, the eugenics arrives, and the measurements of bodies and proportions and colors and the rest of it. And here is an Icelandic physical anthropologist doing a study of he was trained partly in Germany and brought in the standards of photography and bodily measurements used by the theorists of the Holocaust and the Nazi rhetoric and the Nazi state. So there's an unpleasant connection. And in that context, being a descendant of a black slave must have been a bit painful at the time. We no longer work heavily with biological measurements of this kind, and the eugenics is gone. Now we're into the DNA era. And there's a company in Reykjavik, Decode Genetics, which is very influential, and it's working on Icelandic on the Icelandic genome, and has a substantial part of the population in their bank, and that's mainly for sort of understanding health and the Icelandic population. But it's some of the team have dived into the genome of Hans Jonathan, which relates to my story, and it's a fascinating issue. For a few years, a whole team was exploring the genome of Hans Jonathan and reconstructing it, and they published a paper in Nature Genetics. which was revolutionary in the sense that they are reconstructing the genome of someone who is dead and someone who hasn't left any material remains. I mean, we don't have any DNA samples, and even the grave itself is unknown. And what they did was to explore the genome of his descendants, and they can do that because they know from the database with thousands of Icelanders that there is no blackness in the genome until the early 19th century. So what they have then must be the descendants of Hans Jonathan. And from other evidence they can presumably confirm and check and so on the basis of these studies, I mean, the colored, they have 182 genotype descendants, and the colored are his. Analyzing the genomes of these people, they have reconstructed a substantial part of his genome, and that can be used in many ways. One of the questions they raise is where did Hans Jonathan come from? What's the maternity background? We know that the father was white, just sort of indirectly, but genetics would prove it as well. And so this is the mother's line, and they have reference populations from these groups in Eastern and Southern Africa and Western, and then they explore the sort of degree of overlap or similarity between the genome of Hans Jonathan's descendants based on the sort of analysis I just mentioned, and these reference populations. And they conclude that Hans Jonathan's mother and her lineage must have probably have been from, they mention 3 cases, including Liberia. They don't mention Ghana, and I suspect that they, from the historical evidence, I would expect the mother's lineage to be from Ghana, but I can't prove that. And one of the beauties of this study is to assume nothing from literary evidence. Just take the DNA and write the biography in terms of that.
But the image of the population is composed as the population is today. So when they, I'm asking, this is a question, so when they have an idea of the genome of Liberia, that's on the basis of the composition of the people of Liberia today.
Yes.
So going back, exactly, that composition might have been very different also.
Sure.
Very, very
yeah,
different.
exactly.
Sure, and that applies
because Liberia came later. Yes.
Yeah, and that applies to all of this and all kinds. I mean, there was a raging debate in about 20 years ago. I mean, how to go about such studies. I mean, would you sort of establish coordinates on the globe and then take out the boxes and Igbo, Hausa, Icelanders, etc.?
The distance from Liberia to Cameroon, which was mentioned in the article, is the same size as Europe, so it's, you can say it's from Europe.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what does that mean?
Nothing.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's also assuming that it's stable. I mean, there's an assumption that it's stable, but maybe it isn't. I mean, Iceland is a very special case because there hasn't been much necessarily influx from other places for a long time, so that makes for a special image, I suppose, of a population that you can conduct in Iceland. But in the other places that it's compared to, it becomes quite uncertain.
It's this famous case of some. I mean, I was in Newfoundland a couple of years ago. I went to Anson Meadows, the famous. They were not from Iceland; they were from Greenland. But anyway, so there's this theory that they brought one single woman Native American woman back to Iceland,
Mm-hmm.
because they have traced 80 people with mitochondrial stuff in Iceland, but I mean it could obviously come from Denmark, from wherever, from the 18th century or the 19th century or so.
Yeah.
So for historical evidence, I mean.
Yeah, it's uncertain, I would say.
Yes.
Yeah.
It is. It's
You don't have to assume anything. I mean, this is just the evidence you have and the methods you have, and given them, this is the result. But I suspect these samples are not high resolution. I mean, you would want hundreds of thousands in Ghana itself, for example, and then also have a sense of migrations since
Yeah, exactly. That's
1790s.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
They must have necessarily.
I mean, there were trading activities going
Sure.
on for
Yeah.
centuries.
Sure. Nevertheless, it is a potentially powerful avenue into biography and history, and that's what I think this is an important kind of first step. So they achieved two things. Telling us where Hans Jonathan's mother probably came from in Africa, given all these limitations with the data, and secondly, reconstructing a substantial part of the genome. And that's kind of a biography. It's writing, in a sense. I mean, DNA for many people is text. And the news about the reconstruction of the genome was all over the place in Scandinavia, France, and the media exposure is interesting. It's a story of its own. I made a documentary with a friend, and this is a stage scene of Hans Jonathan with the Icelandic wife. Ren Jurassic Park, DNA fra død manns genskapt. And interestingly, when Nature Genetics published the article online, this was not in the printed edition, but in the online edition, they kind of juxtaposed Hans Jonathan's own handwriting, sort of text in our sense, and the reconstructed DNA, kind of the two biographies. And the paternity issue is interesting, and it shouldn't be too long. It's been a mystery and still is. And I have a theory in my book that the father was a clerk, a young guy from Denmark who happened to be 3 years in St. Croix, later became a famous musician in Boston, Hans Gram, and the Gram family in Copenhagen is well known. But others have reasoned that he was the son of Schimmelmann, the owner of Hans Jonathan on the plantation. And it was quite common in slavery that the owners had concubines or they raped, which was more common, and so they had lots of offspring, classified as mulatto. But I think I have circumstantial evidence to suggest that Schimmelmann, that Gram was the father. But eventually, I'm pretty sure we will find out through DNA.
Because you have the families of they produce DNA too.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we have the Icelanders involved, and I almost made it. I was negotiating with a descendant of a Schimmelmann in Copenhagen who donating a DNA sample, and after talking to his family, and he decided to back out. And I was unfortunate. It would have established once and for all whether the father was Schimmelmann or somebody else, potentially Gram.
Would you suggest yourself?
Good question.
I think so.
Have you done your own genetic analysis?
Yeah.
Yes. With a private company or with
Yeah.
yeah, and you're totally comfortable with that?
Sure.
Okay.
and both with the decogenetics and 23andMe, I think.
But the Schimmelmann family, I mean, that's also, I mean, it's just
It's a
a
bit
heavy.
higher stake,
It's
yes.
like saying, okay, so now we are implicated. It's, I don't know, they are historically implicated anyways. There's so much documentation, but it's like also being biologically, I don't know, it adds something to that whole context.
Sure, and I was arguing that there was a lot of talk at the time about reparation, and the Schimmelmann had lots of slaves, and there's no sign of reparation, and why not establish whether this guy was their son or not?
They also had Nazi relations later. Yeah, so it's just
But I can understand their complications and their worries. Anyway, we will find out.
Perhaps by exclusion.
So I had taken several steps. I found the graveyard of what I think is another son of Hans Gram, the writer on St. Croix, and that's an avenue which is still open. It became too costly and complex, but I almost made it. It turned out there are 3 bodies in the same bag in the graveyard in Greenwood, in Brooklyn, in New York, and having sort of the legal and ethical complications for 3 families and analyzing 3 bodies, it would be hugely expensive, and I gave up. One avenue would be Schimmelmann, and this is his tombstone in Garnison Kirke in Copenhagen, and I thought it would be simple to open and have a sample. It would be complex given the position of the Schimmelmanns, but theoretically possible. But then the archives told me the body had been removed and someplace else, so the stone is just a decoration. And this was in the news in Politiken. You understand the headline. And this is a grandson, and this is a guy in Copenhagen he's a descendant of Hans Jonathan, a few generations, and he happens to be defending his PhD in Copenhagen University in social data analysis next week. Ulf Aslak, quite a guy. And here's an American lady who is working in Copenhagen, and she was interested in these roots. She happened to be living in the street in the center of Copenhagen and discovered that Hans Jonathan had lived there. She came from a family of Hans Jonathan which had moved to New England, and she's now working in Copenhagen. And what she did was to write to the Danish Prime Minister and request clearing the name of his ancestor, and she got a response after the story was in the media, and the Prime Minister kindly said, I mean, colonialism was ugly, but nevertheless there was no statement about reparation or declaration of etc. So that's the story of the guy, but the theme of my talk should be the 2 kinds of biographies, which the paper is on, and I don't think I should take more time.